Trevor and Becky Gingerich are the founders and lead pastors at the Embassy Church, a student church on the campus of Humber College in Toronto. With a courageous passion to reach young adult students with the gospel, Pastor Trevor and Becky have been a light in a dark place, sharing the love of Jesus with students from all over the nation and around the world. Many students have been born again, discipled, and baptized in water, making the choice to serve the Lord and walk in his ways. We are blessed to have Pastor Trevor back with us this morning. Church, would you put your hands together and welcome back Pastor Trevor to RHPC. Bless you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here at Richmond Hill. I mentioned to a couple of people this morning on the way in, it feels like home for us, you know? It's been a long time, and I really appreciate the invitation from Pastor Will to come and share again. I really look forward to reconnecting with you all once a year, sometimes around this time. Now, I'm actually here solo again this morning. I had to leave my wife, Becky, and our two boys behind again this morning. In fact, so just in case some of you are starting to wonder if my wife and kids still do in fact exist, I took this cheesy photo a couple of days ago just so you know that they're all quite real, trust me. And growing fast, especially the 2-year-old on the right with his right foot up on the table, which is new. When I was a kid, my mom, it was always the elbows on the table, right? So this is like, I don't even know what to do with this. This is just strange, but we're working on it, and we're looking forward to the whole sort of afternoon nap thing being done with so that they can accompany me a little bit more often here. So at any rate, so just to start off here, in case you're not too familiar with us, that was an amazing introduction. Thanks, Pastor William, for that. But if you're not familiar with who we are and what we do, here's a little bit more about the kind of ministry that we're involved in, just very, very briefly. I pastor, as you heard, a campus ministry at Humber College, which is located just on the northwest edge of Toronto, Rexdale area, for those of you that are familiar. And long story short, in my 20s, I felt led to plant some kind of ministry at some college, university, somewhere. And eventually I discovered this particular school. And I chose Humber partly because I found out that there was very, very little going on in terms of ministry to this school at all before we arrived. And that was surprising to me because this is a major Canadian campus, and so the need for a Christian voice or ministry or representation at this place to me was just huge. And so in 2008, I took on the role of what we call a campus missionary with Mission Canada and the PAOC, and the work began to build a campus church. We call it the Embassy. And since the beginning, aside from what else we do at Humber, we've held these regular public kind of open-air services on campus for both believers and non-believers alike. This is one of my very, very favorite things about it, actually. So on any given Monday night, it's very normal to have students looking in and listening in sort of from the sidelines as we sing and pray and learn about the Christian faith and call people toward a relationship with Jesus. So by God's grace, and as liberal and secular an institution as Humber tends to be, we are still freely given this space and these weekly opportunities to talk about Jesus and share the gospel in a very public way, which is just very cool. And so we also run a small groups program on campus, giveaways, outreaches, baptisms, which are also pretty exciting, as you can tell up there. And so a lot of energy goes into discipling our student leaders. We love that, and et cetera. Again, there's just a lot of facets to it that we really, really love. And time flies. We've been doing this for almost 11 years now, but honestly, I can say to you this morning that our passion for what we do has only grown over that time. Actually, I'm asked sometimes how we've managed to keep this thing going for so long. And so if you're curious about the model, here's the how, kind of by God's grace, how it works, or how it works most of the time. In truth, the Embassy wouldn't exist without a network of families and local churches and individual donors who have all partnered with us to keep the ministry going to reach this school, because we're not allowed to take up offerings from the school, that school policy. And so just like an overseas missionary, I'm responsible to raise 100% of everything required to keep this crazy thing going year after year, which is challenging work at times, very challenging. But on the upside, it's given us all kinds of opportunity to practice what it means to trust God for what's ahead. And not just for the finances, but for everything we've needed, which is actually where we're headed this morning. In fact, on that note, and just kind of switching gears now, if I could, and just speaking freely here for a couple of minutes, if I could, I wanted to let you in on a little secret, if I might, about us missionary types. Okay? So, and some of the tension that we sometimes live in. So, you see, part of my work, too, is traveling around and showing these pictures and to local churches and sharing about all the good news and all the good reports and helping people celebrate with us, which is something, believe me, I have no problem doing. It's quite fun. But that's often the focus and the emphasis, right? It's like the highlight reel. It's the Instagram feed. You know what I'm talking about? It's the positive, the good-looking stuff. But what we don't always have a chance to share is about some of the less exciting stuff, some of the challenges and issues that don't always make the highlight reel, if you know what I mean. And because although we've had a lot of victories at Humber, the truth is, of course, it took some hard work to get here. And because I'm among friends this morning, and we've been in partnership for, like Pastor Williams said, a long, long time. I mean, you all know me pretty well by now. I thought I'd speak maybe just a little bit more candidly, a little more personally than I sometimes do about some of what it took and what I've learned along the way about myself and my own limitations, which are many, and about God, about who He is and how faithful He can be. So for the time I have left, I wanted to focus in on a topic that I think we can all relate to if you're here this morning and you're human, which is most of you, I'm sure, I hope. And so this is a pretty prevalent issue. It's a very, very common struggle involving a certain kind, like a specific type of fear. And now before we kind of focus in on just this very specific type of scary, let's have some fun with this. I figured, we could maybe take a minute to acknowledge some of the other kinds of fears that might exist in the room today, or maybe not, because different people fear different things, okay? So for some examples, a little primer for a few other quite common fears, other than what I'm getting to, and you might be able to recognize some of these as well. So let's see. And by the way, this is the interactive portion of the service, okay? So if you know the answer to one of these questions, I want you to yell it out to me nice and loud, all right? So let's see if this works. First one up there is called acrophobia. Does anyone know what that one is? Acrophobia. Anyone? Oh, I thought someone said it over there kind of quietly. Acrophobia, no Googling. Acrophobia is fear of heights. Fear of heights, that's right. Which I was thinking about it this week. That's something I wish our 2-year-old had a little bit more of, because he's constantly climbing stuff and falling off stuff and clumsy like his dad. So actually, some of you probably had this fear of heights thing all your life. You just didn't know the term for it. Well, you are, in fact, acrophobic. You've just been diagnosed. You're welcome, right? You're welcome. And we're not done. We're not done this morning either. Another very common fear is called, this is an easy one, you all know this, arachnophobia. What's that again? Yes, fear of spiders, which is very possibly every woman in this room and me. So, I didn't actually know I was arachnophobic until I saw my first dock spider. Has anyone seen a dock spider before up north? Okay, so I remember this vividly. I was on a camp trip with my family at one point up north, just minding my own business, and this massive spider appears to me on the rock next to me, size of my hand at that point. And so, which was embarrassing, because I was with my friends, and I'm told that even though I tend to have a lower voice, let me tell you, I scream just like a girl. So, acrophobia, arachnophobia. People sometimes talk about feeling claustrophobic too, right? That's fear of enclosed spaces. All fairly common, not unusual ones, but then there's the weirder stuff. So into the weird. For a couple more, and these are real conditions, believe it or not. You can look these up. Ecclesiophobia is fear of the church. Now, it seems that none of you deal with this because you're here, so good for you, right? But homilophobia is a fear of sermons, of being preached to. Again, that's a real thing. You can Google it. So if, when I got up here to speak, you had to fight the urge to run away, that's okay. Like, we can still be friends. I'm not that intimidating, and we'll go from here. Anyway, so a couple of these, especially the last two, sound pretty strange, even if they are pretty, like they're real conditions, partly because they're so rare, but not the one that we're talking about this morning. Not so rare at all. In fact, all of us, I think, do experience this one from time to time. And when you're dealing with it in the moment, it's not usually a laughing matter. I'm talking about fear of the future. And those of us who struggle with this this fear, especially in a more serious or more chronic way, the diagnosis usually has the word anxiety in it. It was already mentioned this morning. And it's very common these days. In fact, it's something that I have some firsthand experience with myself. Actually, a friend of mine posted this article a while ago about what's sometimes referred to as the growing anxiety epidemic. It's interesting reading. It's all over the place these days. We know it's the most common form of mental illness in Canada. It affects a lot of people, and it's all about feeling excessively paranoid or fearful about the future. And like I said, I've been there. In fact, as one of those people who has struggled with anxiety in a more chronic way, unfortunately, I warned you this was going to be personal this morning. At certain points in my own journey, I've lived there, sometimes for far too long. But again, like whoever you are, however you're wired, all of us experience at least bouts of this kind of thing from time to time, I think, right? Like just times where we're anxious about where we're headed or how we're going to get there, especially when we're facing some kind of major decision or crisis or obstacle or challenge that seems like insurmountable. Like there's no way I can get past this. You see, part of what can make the future so anxiety-inducing for us mortals, anyway, I think, is that it's not really knowable, right? There's no way of really knowing for sure what's coming down the pike, right? And even if you try your utmost to hedge your bets and set yourself up for a bright future, many people, many wiser, more forward-thinking people than me, like healthier, wealthier, savvier people than on average too, many people have found out, and I think Scripture would also warn us about this too, that, look, tomorrow is not guaranteed. Very little in life actually is, including the stuff that we tend, importantly, including the stuff that we tend to look to for our sense and count on for our sense of security, be it our jobs or our investments, if you've got them, or our health or whatever. Like none of that stuff is bulletproof, and people find that out the hard way all the time. Now, as for God, of course, being by definition timeless and eternal, I believe He knows the future. The problem is I don't, and He won't tell me, and that's frustrating at times. And so, because I'm a planner, I like specifics, I like timelines, flowcharts, whatever He wants to give me, He can just give me, but the problem is He won't give it up. And so I'm forced to live in the dark a lot of the time about what tomorrow may hold, which leads to kind of a sort of the next natural sort of question in my mind, like, how does He expect me to live? How does He expect you to live? Like, where are you and I supposed to draw our confidence from as we go about our lives in general and dealing with the unknowns, including what hardship might just be coming around the bend? Well, there's a very practical thing, I believe, that Scripture encourages God's people to do when we're faced with anxiety about the future. It's very simple. Actually, the Bible has a lot of good to say about dealing with stress and anxiety, but I'm just going to focus on one simple thing this morning, just one simple thing. It's a simple, very practical discipline, spiritual discipline, that I've been able to draw some unusual strength and confidence from. So, we all have favorite Bible characters, right? So people in the Bible that we tend to relate to especially. So for me, one of the characters in the Bible I find most inspiring, most relatable, is the character of Moses. But not for the reasons that you might think. Like when you think of Moses, the picture that might come to your mind is, might be of the guy, as the story goes, with his arms outstretched, right, and the Red Sea splitting in two in front of him, right? Moses the hero. But when I think of Moses, the first picture that comes to my mind, I think of the scene when he's in front of this burning bush, and this is Exodus 3 or 4, I think Exodus 3, and God has just given him this crazy-sounding mission, and he looks terrified. And the mission God gives him was to confront this powerful ruler, his name's Pharaoh, and somehow convince him to let his entire slave force, this entire people group, go scot-free. And Moses is not up for it. He is clearly insecure, he feels intimidated, he is fearful. And so, in fact, the conversation goes back and forth a little bit between Moses and God for a little while. You can read it for yourself, but Moses tries his best to convince God that, look, you've got the wrong guy. And so he starts in by playing what if with God? I'm good at that game too. I'm very good at that game. And so he tries to remind God of the risks associated here that God may not have realized, which is nice of him. So, like, what if the people don't listen to me or to you, but that doesn't really work? God doesn't change his mind. So then he switches to excuse mode. I'm good at that too. So he starts into his personal limitations, his insecurities. So like, look, God, I can't speak. I'm not eloquent enough. I can't lead these people. And no ruler is going to find me that convincing after all. But that doesn't work either. God doesn't relent. So eventually he just gives up. And toward the end of the conversation, it's a flat out refusal. Moses says to God, I can't do it. Send someone else. Send someone else, he says. And look, some hero this Moses is, right? Like fearful, insecure, reluctant leader. And yet, I am so glad that this part of the story is included. And here's why. I am no Moses, obviously, but reading this over, I can relate a bit to his psychology, especially if and when I've sensed that God might be calling me out of my comfort zone to do something that's in any way risky. So I'll share one story with you. I want to try to frame this topic through my own experience. Actually, this story has to do with how we got started at Humber. So a few years after I graduated, I got an email totally out of the blue from a friend of mine, pastor, his name is Brandon, offering me a chance to take this internship with him at this incredible, like hugely successful campus church he had planted years ago at the University of Waterloo. And so it was an unpaid internship, of course, just for the experience. The big idea was so that I could go on and plant some other ministry at some other school somewhere in the future. Which I was a huge fan of campus ministry. I've always believed in it as much as anything else. I just didn't think I was ever cut out for it. It was just not something I didn't have what it took. And so here's how that conversation went, all right? Off and on for a couple of months. Him and I just going back and forth over email like this. Brandon always encouraging me to just like step out, trust God with the details. He'll take care of you. And me responding back, writing back with just another list of reasons why I could never do this, man. Like it's because I had lots, and they were good reasons. They were very good reasons. I had these huge student loans, going without a paycheck at that point, not prudent in my mind. Besides, campus ministry had this reputation of being kind of a difficult, kind of a volatile thing. I knew that many campus ministries don't survive long-term, unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons. And even if I could, like against all the odds, sort of get something established, it would be a ministry full of students that, lived off of craft dinner during the week, right? So, like, they can't pay for it, and I knew that. And anyone who I ever talked to about fundraising just mentioned that it was a difficult road, and on I went. Too many unknowns, too many risks. Like, I appreciate the offer, Brandon, but like pioneering something from scratch, it's not who I am. It's not my jam. But he knew, and I knew eventually, that I was just letting my fear get the better of me again. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be something, this is what I sense God would have me do. And so I did something completely out of character for me at that point. I took a leap of faith. And I quit my job, and I packed up my nice little apartment in Toronto. I moved into my parents' living room because they had no room for me anymore, of course. And I was going to have to lean on their support for a while, which felt like a huge step backwards in my life. But they were good. And I began the journey. And it ended up costing me more than even I thought it would, in fact. And I mentioned this next part only because it really felt like God did not hold up his side of the bargain. Like he was absent. And some of you, maybe you've been there too. And maybe you can relate to that feeling. And that's okay. But it was the beginning of a very difficult and very, very confusing season. And I'll spare you the details, but like after committing to this whole thing in that first 8 to 12 months, everything just kind of went sideways. Honestly, it just felt like everything that could have possibly gone wrong went wrong in the process, so nothing was going right as I was trying to get started. Like roadblocks that popped up that I could have never saw coming, growing financial challenges that looked impossible. For the ministry itself, also personally, just a weird convergence of stuff. Some of it involved some key relationships that were stressed. I was the first guy to try out this whole new local missionary idea the PAOC had, but not everyone supported it, and I saw the need for it, so that got me off on the wrong foot with some organizations and people I looked up to, and other challenges that arose that were way beyond my control, just kind of every direction. But what kind of aggravated things more was the effect that some of this had on my own state of mind. In fact, I had previously gotten some help for some anxiety issues that I had dealt with in college. I had first dealt with in college, and I thought that I had mostly recovered from that stuff, but that was starting to make a real comeback too, and it was kind of a dark place. And suffice to say, I wasn't in a good place for a while, and I just didn't have no sweet clue what to do. And life happens, right? Things don't always turn out the way we hope. I get that. And some of you have been through way worse and way more confusing, way darker situations than I've ever been in, no doubt. Again, that's not why I mentioned this. That's not what I'm driving at. But what really got me was just that whole question of where in the world was God? Like, here I am, after having completely reorganized my life around this dream that I thought God was a part of, that I was told too, and I believed, or I thought I believed, that he was trustworthy. And I was told to step out in faith, and he would take care. And instead, I found myself at the end of my rope in every way, facing the possibility that I had made a huge mistake. And at one point in particular, I decided that enough was enough. I should just, pick up the pieces, try to move on and give up on the whole thing, throw in the towel. Regardless, in the thick of it, faithfulness was a part of God's character that was very much hidden from my view. And maybe, you know what it's like to begin to question where in the world God is and how this is all going to work out and how in the world you're going to pull through this one. Now, I'm going to hit pause on that story right there for just a moment. It has a happy ending, but so stick with me. But in situations like that, I would often find myself retreating to my Bible and trying to find something, looking for some kind of comfort, something that would help me cope. And eventually I made this little discovery. So speaking of Moses, I've always found it encouraging and kind of perspective altering to read through and think through the stories of the Israelites in the Bible. It makes me feel a little bit better about myself, you see, because talk about a bunch of nervous wrecks, okay? So the Israelites experienced their share of stress and anxiety many times throughout their story, especially at one point in particular. These people were no strangers to fear and crippling doubt about where and if God was still with them and still leading them. And so, now, to be fair, the Israelites lived in an absolutely barbaric culture and surrounding sort of world, like violent and tribal, and so some of their fear is probably warranted. After all, this was not a pretty time in human history, but still, they were still so slow to trust God. So anyway, we'll pick up the story, we'll pick it back up from the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, which is my favorite book of the Bible. Just kidding, it's definitely not. And it's probably not any of yours this morning, too. It could be tough reading, so not everyone's go-to. So if it's been a little while since you've read through the book of Deuteronomy, no problem. Here's a refresher about what this book is about. Stay with me for this. The whole book of Deuteronomy is mostly comprised of a collection of speeches given by Moses, who, by the way, appears to have done some growing in his confidence since that last scene at the burning bush. You'll see why. But around this time, Moses delivers these speeches to these people. They're stuck in a desert with nowhere to go. So the beginning of the book picks up right around the time these people have been wandering around a desert for 40 years straight. 40 years of wandering aimlessly around the desert. The Sinai Desert, by the way, looks like this. Cozy, right? So it has not been an easy 40 years, not at all. But there's a reason why they're here, remember? There's a reason why they've been made to endure like so many years in the desert, and it has to do with them succumbing to fear and refusing to trust God the first time he attempted to provide for them a new home. You see, God had promised them earlier, this is a long time ago in fact, that he would eventually bring them to this incredible land, like just overflowing with food and water and livestock and resources. And no longer would they be exiles and nomads. Finally, they'd have a place to call home. They'd have a real future as a family and as a people. And so God brings them to the edge of this land, and he commands them to take it, like take it. But the Israelites are really not so sure about this plan. After all, like it was already occupied by a very strong, very intimidating tribe of people with a pretty wicked and brutal reputation as well. And to make a long story short, like it gets the better of their confidence. And so now God had already promised them victory. He did. He already promised that he would take care of them. The land was already theirs. They simply had to trust him, move forward, charge, But instead, they shrink back in fear. And they start complaining and grumbling against God. They refuse to go any further, which is like default reaction for they're like kids in that sense. It's funny. And once again, it all boils down to a lack of trust in God himself. And so God deals with them in this lack of trust by making them turn around and to wander the desert until the more faithless, more unbelieving generation of Israelites dies off. Okay, so that's the backstory, okay? You're all caught up. All right, so fast forward to Deuteronomy. So here they are again, 40 years later, at the same place, right back where they started, on the verge of entering the promised land for the second time. God, in his mercy, has given them another chance. But like last time, the stakes are high. And Moses has to try to prepare these people again for one heck of a battle. And so it's around this time that Moses starts delivering these discourses to these people, these speeches. So what you see in Deuteronomy is this series of talks meant, among other things, to inspire courage in God's people for the road ahead. So understand this morning. This is a critical moment in Israelite history. Like, if Moses doesn't succeed in inspiring some serious faith and courage in these people for the upcoming battle, they'll have no future. Like, it could be another 40 years before they'll have another chance. So what does he say to them? Well, his strategy to me, as I read this, is so clear. He knows exactly what to say. Maybe because he's no stranger to fear himself, remember. He knows how to set these people up for victory instead of seeing them cave to fear again. And it has to do with reminding them of their history. Okay, so Moses starts in by reminding them about the ways that God had come through for them. So he starts recounting their testimony. He starts recounting their whole history, really event by event. And by doing this, you see, he's jogging their memories about how far they've come and where they've already seen God at work in their story. For example, so throughout the book, Moses reminds them about some of the incredible miracles that God had done right in front of their eyes, like God bringing them out of slavery and oppression to the Egyptians, parting the Red Sea so they could escape once and for all, God feeding them in the desert. Remember that? By dropping food more or less out of the sky, the whole manna thing when they were hungry. And he goes on and on and on. Remember, Moses says. Okay, so much of Moses speaking in Deuteronomy can be summarized by that one word, remember. This is one of the main themes of the entire book. So for just a few examples, I'll show you what I'm talking about. And I love how the NLT brings this out as well. Remember that the Lord rescued you from the iron smelting furnace of Egypt. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Don't you remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh? Remember the days of long ago. Think about the generations past. And it goes on from here, like, remember when you were but slaves to a foreign ruler. Remember when you were hungry and thirsty, and God provided for you, even in the wilderness. And on it goes. Look how far you've come. Why would God abandon you now? Moses is reminding them of God's faithfulness in the past. And it's a simple strategy, but it's brilliant. Like, so in my mind, I can just imagine the people starting to search their memories as Moses is talking, starting to find courage again in these old stories. And maybe they start retelling them to each other, maybe to their children. And these hidden testimonies of God's faithfulness, buried in years of suffering in the desert, buried, right? But they're starting to rise to the surface again as Moses is causing them to remember. So at one point, Moses says this. I like this part. He dares them. Sounds like a dare to me. This is Deuteronomy chapter 4. I'm just going to read this for you. Now search all of history, Moses says to them. From the time God created people on the earth until now, has any other God dared to take a nation for himself, you Israelites, by means of trials, miraculous signs, wonders, war, a strong hand, a powerful arm, and terrifying acts? Yet that is what the Lord your God did for you in Egypt right before your eyes. Remember. You see, the problem was, at times, they had forgotten how to remember. That's what often caused them, remember, to shrink back in fear and defeat. And Moses knows that. And so he commands this of God's people. And I think we need to pay attention here. I think we can take a cue from this. You and I both, very much. Watch out. Be careful never to forget what you yourself have seen. Do not let these memories escape from your mind as long as you live. Remember. Why? Because, like the Israelites, we can tend to forget. Can't we? It's just human nature. It just is. And we find ourselves gripped by fear and gripped by anxiety about the future, as if God has not really actually proven himself faithful enough to us already in the past. You know what's kind of interesting to me? Those writers of the Bible who seem to know God most intimately, so Moses for one of them for sure, David for another example in the Psalms, other writers in the Old Testament, even New Testament, like Paul as well, they're always talking about this one attribute of God, right? It's true. It's his faithfulness. It's all over the place in Scripture, God as faithful. But you'll notice while you're reading that they all do this too. They really do. They're always recalling past or prior memories and stories. They're always recalling their history and retelling these old stories. Seriously, by the time you've read through the Bible, you'll have read some of the same stories over and over and over again. It's very repetitive reading sometimes, but it's for a reason. These stories must be retold. It's part of remembering. It's how they can say that God is faithful and actually have something to hinge that belief on. God's people draw courage for the future by reflecting on the past. It's what we've always done. So practically, okay, like just really dead practical this morning. I warned you this is going to be simple, but this is about spending less time and less mental energy stressing out about what's ahead and more time and more energy reflecting on how God has taken care of you up to this point. That's what it is. That's the whole paradigm shift I'm talking about, and I think that Scripture holds out to us if we're willing to listen. And it is a bit counterintuitive, I know. I know this. It seems to be kind of human nature to be paralyzed by fear of the unknown, but God's people are to be people who have long memories, who operate not from fear of the future, not from what I can't possibly know, but from what I do know. And do you know what I know, maybe some of you do, is that over the course of my story and over the course of my life, God has not actually left me for a moment. And that's true. And He is faithful. So I operate from that. I operate from there, not from there. Am I making sense this morning? The thing about God's faithfulness that many of the biblical writers seem to kind of understand, if you want courage for the road ahead, you've got to be willing to look behind you. Besides, hindsight is 20/20, right? Don't we say that all the time? Hindsight is 20/20. So especially for those of you who are here this morning that maybe you've been following Jesus for a longer time than I have, probably. I'm sure that many of us in this room have certain testimonies of certain victories, maybe struggles we overcame, addictions we've kicked, doors that opened in front of us, prayers that answered, whatever God stories you might have. In fact, if we had time this morning, we could probably pass the mic around this morning and let some of these stories come out and rise to the surface. We'd probably all walk out of here feeling pretty encouraged, pretty inspired, right? Because that's just how it works. That's the power of testimony. That's the power of remembering, recalling, retelling what God has done. And we need that so that these stories don't escape from our minds. Because when we hit struggle, we can just be so quick to forget what God has already done. But if we can manage to make that shift, like the Israelites, we will find perspective and strength to move forward confidently and boldly into the future. And just maybe we'll find the same kind of incredible confidence Moses has to say this as he challenges people at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Therefore, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you, and He will never leave you nor forsake you. The word there is never, never. I think that's as true of God 3,000 years ago as it is still today, and it's good news. Again, looking back over the course of my life, I think that becomes obvious. So, in fact, to wrap this up, finish that story I was sharing with you here, in the thick of that rather difficult situation I described, I made a decision. So I resolved to begin a new little spiritual discipline. Here's what I did. So someone mentioned to me this journal they kept, and I hadn't done a lot of journaling up to that point, but I decided to give it a shot, nothing to lose. So I actually began writing out longhand, recalling the ways that I had seen God provide for me and guide my life in the past, including a list of everything I was thankful for. That was a long list. And some of you might recall a story about another Bible character. His name's Samuel, who sets up this altar at one point, a stone of remembrance. It's called an Ebenezer. Any of you remember that? And so it was this stone, this altar, and it was so that God's people could look at this thing. It was a physical reminder that would jog their memories about what God had done for them in the past, and which I'm not suggesting that you go home and try to build one of those things on your front yard. I don't think you'll get the permit, but for me, I decided that that might be helpful, and so I stuck with a journal instead, good plan B, and so I began to write down, began to call to memory daily, often, everything I was thankful for, everything that God had blessed me with. In fact, the Bible has a lot to say about gratitude and thankfulness and the importance, notice, of that in a believer's life. Actually, experts tell us, too, these days that cultivating a mindset of thankfulness can have quite the effect on a person's psyche. Gratitude can change your whole state of mind. It's nice when the medical community kind of catches up to the Bible's wisdom. You know, I appreciate that. So it helped me too. I realized that partly through that exercise that I actually have some amazing stories that I had forgotten, just amazing ways that God had provided for my life in the past. And I discovered that, I don't really have any real reason to believe or even feel like God was somehow less present or less faithful to me now than he had been up to that point. And slowly, through that process, and over the next few weeks, and as I also began to shut down, capture thoughts and thought processes that were not helpful, another biblical idea, by the way, etc., my perspective began to shift a bit, and slowly I began to find some courage to move forward. And then things started to change. So fast forward a bunch, I had this 20-minute conversation with a guy in Starbucks who had heard about what we wanted to do at Humber, and he wrote me a check for $10,000 to help us get started, which doesn't happen as often as I wished it did. Don't get me wrong, but most productive 20-minute coffee of my life. And so, and suddenly we could buy sound equipment. And over the next few months, slowly the resources started to come in. People were generous. And I started to realize this crazy, ridiculous idea might just work. And then we launched on campus, and the rest is history. And what a ride. What a ride. Ups and downs, including more challenges that came my way that I couldn't have possibly seen coming, and yet more opportunities to learn about where my help really comes from. And I don't regret the hard stuff. I don't regret the harder parts of the journey. I don't. Because, it's how I can stand up here and tell you through my own experience, through my own story, that God really is faithful. And what blows my mind is his patience for me. And maybe you can relate, but I am just like the Israelites. In the past, I've been so slow sometimes to trust God to provide for my needs. I see myself in their story, really, including when God provides for them, even while they're wallowing in despair. He comes through. Even when I've been faithless, God has been so faithful. And I'm just so glad that even when I wanted to throw in the towel, I didn't. I could have missed out on so much. And so one more time, I think this is such timely advice for us, just kind of living in a stressed out society that we do. Watch out. Be careful never to forget what you yourself have seen. You must not forget how to remember. Now, my time's up here, so I'll skip forward here. In conclusion, I don't expect God to spare me or you from every hardship. That's not what I believe, and he doesn't promise that, remember. But he does promise you one thing, and some hardships and struggles are very good for us and very good for our growth, and it's sometimes the only way that we change. I seem to learn nothing when I'm happy. It's kind of interesting. But God does promise us one thing, and it's big, and I'll leave you with this morning, that he will be with you, and that his presence will go with you as you hit the valleys, as you walk through it. And seasons in my life that are easy and smooth, they don't tend to shape my character or grow my trust in God as much, or my relationship. That stuff seems to come more often through hardship. And so I mentioned the Psalms, and so even though David spent a lot of time lamenting and complaining, that's true, he also knew God as being close to the brokenhearted. So if that's you this morning, brokenhearted, I understand some of you might be this morning, and things are dark, be encouraged. God is closer to you than you probably think. And if you choose to lean into him and not away from him, you might find he hasn't actually left you for a moment. Let's pray, shall we? Let's pray. And just as we move to pray here, the service wraps up and the week begins over again. I wanted to leave you with something from Isaiah chapter 4. Just consider these words this morning, and we're done. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Why do you complain? Why do you say, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth, and he will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. And he gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength, and they will soar on wings like eagles, and they will run and not grow weary, and they will walk and not be faint. Father, we are so thankful that we serve a God this morning who is present with us, who knows how many hairs on our head we have. That is an amazing thought. And I know that there are people in this room that are likely going through things that are difficult and dark and they can't see their way out. I am so glad you go with us. Help us to remember that, and help us in struggle and suffering not to lean away from you, but lean into you, because you are all we need. In your name, amen. Thanks, everybody.